I don't think there is hardly anyone in our country who is not aware of the archetype popularized on the silver screen of Superman. Perhaps even more so because the outstanding actor who has done so well with that theme has subsequently suffered such a terrible fate. But without wanting to spend a great deal of time on that, as a sort of a student of contemporary as well as ancient myths, I always felt that the American myth of Superman was sort of the clearest example of the shining hero at an archetypal level in the modern mythology of our culture. And when we sort of come to an apprehension of that, how he fights for truth, can't even remember all the name, the truth and the right and truth, justice, truth in the American way, you see. We have really sort of the culture hero of perhaps an earlier period of the development of consciousness in our culture, when our awareness of the darker side and the anti-heroic side was still little developed. So that when one looks at the myth of Superman, whether in the literary form or on the movie screen now, it appears more than a little bit campy. And the reason for that, I think, is primarily that we have gradually become aware of so much more of the complexities, and especially the complexities into which the element of darkness and of the shadow is interwoven. Yet it is important to see that these kinds of heroic myths exist, and then obviously the counter-heroic story must exist also. Just because of our one-sidedness, which I alluded to last time as being largely the psychological heritage of the monotheistic God image, we tend to be temperamentally somewhat blind to the dark side of reality. And if you I'm sure that if you conducted an honest survey of a fairly large number of people in the country today, you would ask them, do you believe in God? Well, most of them will say yes. If you ask the same people whether you believed in the devil, you would find probably a much smaller percentage. Yet in a certain way, and I don't mean necessarily theologically or philosophically, but psychologically, the two are really dependent on each other. One cannot see the shadow without the light, but as long as there is light, every object casts a shadow. And this is the great psychological metaphor for the dark always being there. And if we look, let's say, at Clark Kent, the Superman, we look at Clark Kent, the Superman, who obviously has extraterrestrial archetypal origins, but who is raised in the heartland, in the epitome of Middle America, in Smallville, Kansas, I think. You find, however, ultimately that it might be said, I think, with some degree of justification, that as indeed is in the case of most shining heroes from the solar deities down to Siegfried and now to Superman, to a major extent these heroes stand for heroic consciousness in a psychological sense. They are sort of the glorified and at times perhaps individuated ego, the carrier of consciousness. Just like Apollo races over the sky in his solar chariot drawn by his fiery horses, later on to be sort of replaced in that role to a certain extent by the prophet Elijah, or Elias as the Greeks call him, who has curiously become one of the most popular saints of the Greeks. And a friend of mine who lived in Greece for a long time, he reported to me, and I have no reason to disbelieve him, that the chapels dedicated to Saint Elias, for instance, are usually placed on the top of mountains and hills, and that often they are the very places where the temples of Apollo stood. This is how the archetypal keynote is passed on in another religion. Various other adult tormentors upon whom we depend, telling us, good kid, bad boy, bad girl, so forth, when they do something else. And so the issue of some things being good, some things being bad enters the picture, then the ego forms, and then a lot of the things that we have inside of us and that have been called bad begin to constellate themselves in the unconscious. They are cast out from the ego, they are not admitted into the ego. So this is, in a way, our own war in heaven, the separation of the, quote, good, the conscious side, from the enshadowed side inside of us. And this is how, in the Old Testament myth, Yahweh becomes the good Lord on the one hand, and then there arises the diabolical Superman, the devil. While originally it's understood that the one God has good and bad tendencies, Yesirim as they are called in Hebrew, and that's explained in certain ways in the Kabbalah and so forth. But there is more psychological wisdom in this, I think, than perhaps even Chesterton himself realized, because it indicates that by having the external devil, you don't have to admit to the existence and the presence within you, or at least in very close proximity to your consciousness, the internal devil. And so that the concentrating on the external devil becomes a way of deflecting that recognition of the internal devil. But the fact of the matter is that these things go on both externally and internally. And of course, the self-condemnation, and you might almost say the self-diabolization, then really leads often, I think, to horrendous phenomena. And so I would say that in the idea of the devil as this Superman, as the counter-hero, we must confront the fact that in perceiving evil in our fellow humans, we are manifesting the accusatory devilishness of the shadow and are engaging in a sort of primitive act of counter-heroism. The person who fights evil in the objective world, and especially in a compulsive fashion, whether this is done verbally or even mentally or in actual deed, is in fact sort of the caricature of the Superman hero who fights for consciousness.